True Tales, I'm going to share a secret that only I knew. Well, this secret is a secret so big that if this person's family knew the truth, it would completely shatter their reality. But I think it's time for me to reveal this secret, a secret that I've held for, gosh, many, many years, since 2009. I grew up with a kid. His name was George. Let's just call him George. And George was an extremely talented artist. And George's parents invested all their time and money and energy into George's art career. And as an artist, he was given everything possible, all the tools, all the resources, all the education to make his art dreams come true. And I knew George since I was about 15 years old. When George and I grew up, we hung out during college and we had many adventures together, and his parents were just great. They gave him everything he could possibly need and more. Well, George finished his diploma and I finished mine, and I got married and I moved to California. Then I had a phone call with George one day. George was on the East Coast and I was on the West Coast. And this is a phone call that I will never forget as long as I live because this phone call taught me a very powerful lesson. So, George and I were talking about his post graduation plans. George said to me that his parents told him that it was time for him to move out of the house, get a job, and begin his career in his art. But George said to me that he had no intention of doing his art. And in fact, he really didn't want to work at all. So George said that he was going to go to Asia to work and take a sort of sabbatical away from his art and away from real life and just be a young man for a while. So he was going to go teach English in an Asian country. George really didn't know what to do with himself. I myself, being newly married, and this was during the recession, was making do and making ends meet as a young newlywed with no money and just starting out in her life and career as an adult. And I said to George, you need to go back when all of this is done and start doing your art. And George says he doesn't want to go back and do that. In fact, he said something that I will never, ever forget. A secret that I had held for my entire life. A secret that only he and I knew. And I'll tell you why. George said to me, if I had my way, I would live at home and my parents would take care of me for the rest of my life. I remember in that moment thinking to myself, what an odd thing to say. Why would a young man have such a desire, a fantasy to be infantilized and stay at home and have his mommy and his daddy take care of him? I remember standing at the phone. This was 2009 when we had the phones and the landlines, and I'm standing next to the phone on the cordless phone. And I'm thinking to myself, what an odd thing to say. But as I'm thinking that, I get this terrible feeling from within me that something was going to go wrong and that George was going to regret saying those words. And I said to George, that's a strange thing to say. Why would you say that? You're a young man with an amazing talent. You can do anything. But that was his desire. Fast forward. He goes to Asia to teach English, And when he's there, he gets struck down with non Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer that requires him to go home. And if you remember, during this time in the world, people with pre existing conditions had limited health care choices and limited insurance. And with non Hodgkin's lymphoma, the medical bills were astronomical. And his amazing, loving, incredible parents scrambled doing everything they could to raise money for his care. Thanks to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, his pre existing condition, which was found in Asia, that's what the insurance people wanted to use as an excuse to deny him medical coverage, was reversed and he was able to get medical care thanks to the Affordable Care Act. And so, for the next 10 years, George lived at home with cancer, staying in his bedroom, and his parents took care of him until his dying day. You might be saying, oh, what a strange coincidence. Maybe he knew that he was going to get this cancer and that he was going to pass away like this. I don't think so. I think that deep inside of him, knowing this kid since I was 15 years old, he had no desire to live an adult life. He had no desire to strike out on his own. He had no desire to do his art. So much so that when he was on an interview with a television camera and interviewer asking about his art, I could see, knowing him and knowing this secret, I could see as he looked in the camera when the newscaster asked, what about your art? Are you going to make more art? And he looked at the camera with a little glimmer in his eye, saying, nope, I don't have the strength. I know what I'm saying to you seems pretty crazy and pretty wild that somebody would give themselves cancer. I don't think he gave himself cancer. I think he gave himself a reason to stay home and have his parents take care of him. And a lot of people will wonder, is that really true? Decide for yourself. I'm not here to convince you of that. I'm here to tell you the story. All of the great spiritual teachings say the magic word abracadabra, that which I speak, I create. And when I heard George say this to me, I knew he was creating something that was going to be completely life changing. And ever since that moment, I have been very careful about what I said. And don't get me wrong, I've made mistakes. I used to say to myself, oh, that's depressing. I'm so depressed. And lo and behold, I got postpartum depression. So I don't say the word depressed or depressing anymore. I'm not here to tell you why people get cancers or diseases. There's a million reasons why. There are a million reasons why, for a million lessons. But you have to remember that life, this world, this realm, is the mental realm. Whatever we think, whatever we say, with the mind and the spirit and our intentions, we give life. And I believe from my lesson with George that he created the perfect experience that would allow him and entitle him to stay home and have his parents take care of him for the rest of his life. And I know that this is the most shocking story that anybody, especially a parent, could hear. But that is a real story. It truly happened. And towards the end of his life, his parents were scrambling to raise money to transport him because his immune system was so low that traveling on an airplane or a bus was dangerous. And I remember writing them a very large check that they were so surprised to receive. And deep inside of me, I knew that that money wasn't going to help heal him or fix him, but it was a symbol and a gesture of my love for his family and everything that they had gone through to try to help him to survive this. But the secret was he had no intention of living life on his own. He had no intention of doing his art. He had no intention of striking out and being his own man. he wanted to stay at home and have his parents take care of him for the rest of his life. And by God, he got it. So don't feel sorry for him. He got exactly what he wanted. Don't feel bad for him. He lived the life that he wanted. And I don't feel bad for him either. And so let this be a lesson. That which you speak, you create. So be careful what you wish for. You just might get it. So thank you for joining me on this episode of True Tales. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever spoken something and then created it for better or for worse? Let me know in the comments.